Before the Dust Bowl became a name synonymous with suffering, the Great Plains of Texas were seen as a land of opportunity. Stretching for miles with vast open prairies, the soil was rich and inviting. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, settlers flocked to the region, driven by promises of fertile land and government incentives like the Homestead Act. With the backdrop of World War I, the demand for wheat skyrocketed. The U.S. government encouraged farmers to plow up more land to feed American and European troops. With modern mechanized farming and little knowledge of long-term soil conservation, the plains were tilled more than ever before. For a time, prosperity reigned. But this aggressive expansion set the stage for one of the worst environmental disasters in U.S. history. The 1920s brought good harvests, but prosperity was short-lived. As World War I ended, wheat prices plummeted, forcing farmers to plant even more land in hopes of making up for their losses. However, nature had different plans. By the early 1930s, a severe drought gripped Texas and the surrounding states. With little rainfall, the once fertile soil turned to dust. The native prairie grasses, which had anchored the land for centuries, had been removed for farming, leaving the earth vulnerable to the strong winds that swept across the plains. Then, in 1932, the first of many dust storms hit. The dry, loose soil was lifted into the air, creating black blizzards that darkened the sky for miles. Farmers and townspeople were caught unprepared. Cattle died, crops failed, and families began to lose everything they had worked so hard to build. As the drought worsened, Texas saw a level of devastation unlike anything before. The sun scorched the earth, turning fields into barren wastelands. Wells ran dry, and communities struggled to find water. The wind, relentless and cruel, continued to tear through the plains, lifting the topsoil and carrying it across the country, even reaching the East Coast. The Dust Bowl was no longer a local problem. It was a national catastrophe. The years between 1934 and 1936 were some of the hardest. The worst storm of them all came on April 14, 1935, a day now known as Black Sunday. That afternoon, an enormous dust storm roared across the plains, stretching hundreds of miles wide. It swallowed towns in minutes, turning daylight into darkness. Texans tried to find shelter, covering their faces with wet cloths to protect themselves from choking on the dust. Children ran home from school, blinded by the debris. The dust found its way into every crack of homes and buildings, coating everything in a thick layer of dirt. People suffered from dust pneumonia, their lungs filling with fine particles that made breathing nearly impossible. As farms collapsed and livestock perished, thousands of families faced starvation and ruin. The land that once seemed so promising had turned against them. The psychological toll was severe. Many people lost hope, feeling trapped in a never-ending storm. Churches were packed with desperate prayers, while others simply abandoned their land, unable to endure the suffering any longer. Reports of farmers taking their own lives became increasingly common. A sense of hopelessness spread through Texas, leaving only those with no other option to continue fighting against nature itself. For many Texans, staying in the Dust Bowl was no longer an option. Entire towns were abandoned as families packed up whatever they could and left in search of a better life. Most headed west, to California, where they hoped to find work in agriculture. However, they were met with harsh realities. The Great Depression was at its peak, and jobs were scarce. Many Dust Bowl refugees, or Okies as they were often called, regardless of whether they were from Oklahoma or Texas, found themselves in labor camps, struggling to survive on meager wages. Meanwhile, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal programs and the Civilian Conservation Corps and Soil Conservation Service aimed to restore the land and support struggling farmers. Efforts were made to plant trees as windbreaks, introduce better farming techniques, and rehabilitate the damaged soil. But for many, the damage had already been done. The migration was not without its own struggles. Families traveled in old, battered cars, often breaking down on the side of the road. Parents tried to shield their children from the worst of the suffering, but hunger and exhaustion followed them wherever they went. Some found work, but most were treated as outsiders, unwanted and unwelcome. By the late 1930s, the dust storms began to subside, but the scars they left remained. The start of World War II in 1939 marked another turning point for Texas and the nation. With war came renewed demand for agricultural goods, leading to economic recovery in the region. Many men from Dust Bowl families joined the military, leaving behind the barren farms to fight overseas. Others found work in war industries, particularly in shipbuilding and aircraft manufacturing in cities like Houston and Dallas. The war effort brought money and jobs, helping many escape the poverty the Dust Bowl had inflicted. As the war raged on, the U.S. government invested heavily in farming technology, irrigation systems, and infrastructure. Those who remained in Texas saw the slow revival of their land, though memories of the dust storms haunted them. Farmers who once fought against nature now had government support to implement better soil management techniques, preventing another disaster of the same scale. World War II not only saved Texas from economic despair, but also transformed it into an industrial powerhouse. Military bases were built, industries flourished, and cities grew rapidly. The once abandoned farms were now surrounded by growing urban centers, offering new opportunities for those who had once been Dust Bowl refugees. The Texas Dust Bowl remains one of the most devastating environmental disasters in U.S. history. It reshaped the agricultural landscape, forcing a shift toward more sustainable farming practices. The government implemented long-term soil conservation measures, and farmers became more aware of the dangers of overworking the land. But the Dust Bowl was more than just an environmental crisis. It was a human tragedy, forcing thousands to flee their homes and forever altering the identity of Texas and the Great Plains. It was a time of immense suffering, but also of resilience. For those who lived through it, the memories of dust storms blotting out the sun, of cracked earth and dying crops, of empty dinner tables and lost homes would never fade. The Dust Bowl stands as a warning, a reminder that nature must be respected and that the choices we make today can shape the future for generations to come. The Texas Dust Bowl is a story of hardship, survival, and eventual rebirth. From the overworked lands of World War I to the struggles of the Great Depression, and finally to the recovery spurred by World War II, it remains a defining chapter in American history. Though the storms have long passed, their impact is still felt today, in the lessons learned and the resilience of those who endured.